In a world of noise, bias, and spin, intelligence may be the only currency that matters. Welcome to This Week Explained. I'm Tiana, and as always, I am joined by 20-plus year intelligence veteran Kervin. We go behind the front lines to bring you the factual, actual intelligence that you need. No fluff, no agenda, because we value the truth and your time. Before we start, I want you to know this broadcast is powered by the Leon Media Network. From sports to education, find your next obsession, like Can We Please Talk? Or At Least You Heard It Here at leonmedianetwork.com. We are also caffeinated through those late nights of intelligence reporting by fresh roasted coffee. They've set up a special offer just for our listeners. To get the best deal, you must click the link in our show notes and enter the code THISWEEK. That's THISWEEK to get 20% off your first order. It's genuinely some of the best coffee you can buy, and you'll be supporting the show, so check that out. Now, are you guys ready for the real story? Let's get into the update. This week, we are witnessing a world where diplomatic optimism is increasingly decoupled from the kinetic reality of the front lines. The distance between the rhetoric of a conference hall and the survival of a nation has never felt more cavernous. For Europe, negotiators in Miami and Brussels project a sense that a deal is closer than ever, yet the intelligence community warns that the Russian objective of restoring a Soviet-style empire remains unchanged. While peace plans are drafted on paper, Vladimir Putin uses 4-hour marathons of vitriol to demand territorial concessions for land his forces do not even fully occupy, reminding the West that the price of peace is a return to a Russian sphere of influence. In Gaza, the vision of a high-tech Riviera under the Project Sunrise proposal is colliding with a fractured landscape of internal power struggles. While Washington circulates a billion-dollar blueprint for a Mediterranean tech hub, local militias and Hamas are locked in a gritty struggle for control of the ruins, proving that you cannot build a smart city in a territory where no one holds a stable monopoly on force. And in the Caribbean, the narco-terrorism label has transformed the theater into a functional blockade. The U.S. is now seizing tankers and asserting a doctrine of preemptive self-defense against weapons of mass destruction, forcing a direct military-to-military confrontation with the Venezuelan Navy that threatens to turn a drug war interdiction into a mainland war. From the vengeance strikes of Operation Hawkeye Strike in Syria to the fragile borrowing of 90 billion euros to keep Ukraine's lights on, the global board is being reset by force. In this episode, we examine the volatile friction between a new era of high-stakes diplomacy and the calculated application of military power redefining the world's borders. All right, Kervin, we have spent years discussing the trajectory of the war in Ukraine, and it feels as though we have reached a confluence of events that will decide the next decade of European security. You and I have maintained on this show since February of 2022 that this conflict was never solely about the Donbass or the eastern provinces. We have argued that Vladimir Putin views this as a restoration project for the former Soviet Empire. And if you look at the latest intelligence reporting coming out of Washington, that assessment is being reinforced. And honestly, where have y'all been? We've been saying this for years. Thank you for finally catching up. Even as peace talks are being organized in Miami and Brussels, the underlying intelligence suggests that Putin has not modified his long-term strategic objectives, which is probably why he keeps going back on all the peace deals. He wants to keep going. He still seeks the entirety of Ukraine and remains a latent threat to the former Soviet bloc, including NATO members like Poland and the Baltic states. There seems to be a significant disconnect right now. On one hand, the Trump administration and its negotiators are projecting a high level of optimism. They are saying a deal is closer than ever. On the other hand, the intelligence community is essentially saying, do not be fooled by the rhetoric. The intent has not changed. So how does an analyst reconcile those two perspectives?
Well, you don't. Negotiators often focus on the how, so the mechanics of a ceasefire, the lines on a map, also the security guarantees, but intelligence looks at the why. If the Russian objective remains the degradation of Ukrainian sovereignty, then any peace deal is viewed by Moscow as not the final resolution. It's going to be viewed as a tactical pause. Now, the intelligence indicates that while Russia may lack the current military capacity to overrun all of Europe today, the desire to do so remains a pillar of their foreign policy.
All right, so let's talk about the how for a moment. This 20-point peace plan being discussed in Miami, it involves some very specific and frankly controversial trade-offs. We're hearing about caps on the Ukrainian military and the deployment of European security forces.
Yeah, so essentially, the proposal suggests a European led force to act as sort of a tripwire against future Russian aggression. This would be supported by United States intelligence and also air patrols. Now, the friction point is the territorial concessions. There is pressure on Kyiv to cede areas that they currently control. And President Zelensky is in a very difficult position because he's being asked to trade land for security guarantees that actually remain undefined. So he's asking a very fair question. What do these guarantees actually do?
And like usual, Putin is not exactly making it easy. He sat for a 4-hour marathon broadcast recently, and while he spoke about peace, he was quite vitriolic. He used derogatory language toward European allies and reiterated that his terms must be met, which includes Ukraine leaving regions that Russia does not even fully occupy yet.
Yeah, Putin is negotiating from a position of perceived strength. He cited the fact that his forces have gained significant ground this year. His rhetoric about respect and not being cheated is a recurring theme. He's essentially telling the West that the price of peace is a return to a Russian sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. It's also worth noting the timing of this. He offered a ceasefire for elections in Ukraine. Now, this is obviously a clear attempt to influence the internal political stability of Kyiv.
So while all of this high level diplomacy is happening, there is a massive now problem. Ukraine is facing a catastrophic shortage. We saw the European Union leaders huddled in Brussels for 17 hours to solve this. They finally reached a deal, but it was not the one that many expected.
No, look, it was a significant compromise. Now, the original plan was to use the interest or the principal of the 210 billion euros in frozen Russian assets. Now, Belgium, where most of those assets are held, they stayed firm on the risks to doing that. And we spoke about this a few months ago. Belgium is worried about the legal retaliation and the stability of their financial institutions. So the European Union decided to borrow 90 billion euros against their own budget instead.
So is that a victory for Ukraine, however small a victory it may be, or just a temporary bandage?
Yeah, I think it's both. It provides the economic resilience needed to keep the lights on and kind of get the drones to keep moving through the spring, but it also highlights the fractures within Europe. You have countries like Hungary and Slovakia. They refused to back this deal. And the Czech Republic refused to guarantee the loans. Now, it shows Putin that while Europe can find a way to act, the consensus is becoming increasingly fragile.
So you have the Miami talks, the EU funding, and the reality of the front lines all moving at once. Putin is saying there will be no more wars if he is treated with, quote, respect, end quote. But hours after he said that, missiles were hitting Odessa.
Yeah, I guess he wasn't being treated with respect, is what he would say. Now, that is the reality of this theater, right? The words in a television studio or a summit hall rarely match the kinetic reality on the ground. Now, for the intelligence community, the focus remains on whether these peace proposals actually address the root cause of the war or if they simply create a new, more dangerous status quo.
It is a lot to process, and the stakes truly could not be higher for the European continent. Now, before we move into our regional updates, I want to discuss the current state of Gaza. We are seeing a very strange, almost bifurcated reality on the ground right now. On one hand, there is a ceasefire in place, but on the other, there are these internal power struggles and massive high-level reconstruction proposals that feel worlds apart from the daily reality of the people living there. So, Kerbin, Where do we actually stand with the power dynamic inside the enclave?
Honestly, it's a fractured landscape, Tiana. To understand Gaza right now, you have to look at what we discussed last week, the yellow line, that military boundary established by Israel. And to the west of that line, Hamas is actively working to reconsolidate its control. Now, they remain the dominant force where the majority of the population resides. But to the east, in the areas under Israeli military oversight, a vacuum has opened. That vacuum is being filled by several small, armed militias that are openly hostile to Hamas.
And these groups are not just scattered gangs anymore, correct? It sounds like they're becoming more organized. We saw reports of the assassination of an imam in the South recently, and that felt like a very deliberate message.
Yeah, it was. It really was. The assassination of Sheikh Mohammed Abu Mustafa is a perfect example of the insurgency within an insurgency that is taking place. These groups, like the Counterterrorism Strike Force and the Popular Defense Army, are positioning themselves as a local alternative to Hamas. They are led by individuals who were often imprisoned by Hamas in the past, and they are now conducting raids and hit and run attacks, essentially trying to prove that Hamas can no longer provide security or governance.
You mentioned governance. That is the part that feels the most ambitious. These militias are apparently trying to recruit professionals like doctors and lawyers and offering quite significant salaries. But who is actually backing them?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit before. That hidden was this Israeli support. Well, that's an open acknowledge. They've openly acknowledged that now. Um, these factions operate from bases within the Israeli controlled zones. And if you remember, we had a conversation about how Israel had been using these militias to fight Hamas. It looks like the strategic intent seems to be the creation of a vetted local force that can manage humanitarian aid routes and eventually provide a framework for a day after government that does not include Hamas. Now, the legitimacy of these groups is very thin. Most Gazans view them with deep suspicion, often seeing them as proxies or Israeli collaborators.
I mean, that makes sense because they are Israeli
Yeah.
collaborators. They've already said. Okay, so I mean, that brings us to the Project Sunrise proposal. So while these militias are fighting in the streets, the Trump administration is circulating a 32-page vision for a total transformation of Gaza. It is being described as a high tech Riviera. So, Kervin, how does a luxury coastal destination fit into a territory that is currently in ruins?
Well, it doesn't, Tiana. If we look at other geographies with immense natural potential, I'm talking about the Somali coastline, Haiti, even Venezuela, which we're going to discuss later. The pattern is consistent. Economic optimism cannot bypass a fundamental lack of security. You can design the most sophisticated luxury infrastructure imaginable, but without a stable monopoly on force and a resolution to the underlying grievances, the investment risk remains untenable. Now, the Project Sunrise proposal you talked about is staggering in scale. $112 billion dollars over 2 decades to build high speed rail, smart city grids, and premium coastal developments. It even designates Rafah as the new administrative capital. All eyes on Rafah for this new capital. But the entire blueprint relies on a singular, massive geopolitical assumption: the total demilitarization and decommissioning of Hamas.
Which Hamas has already rejected. It feels like a significant disconnect. You have a proposal that requires a security environment that simply does not exist yet.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And there is another glaring omission in the Project Sunrise documents. While the plan details where the mosques and the schools will go, it does not specify where the displaced population, over 2 million people, is supposed to live during the decades long construction process. It treats the territory almost as a blank slate, which ignores the humanitarian and political reality of the people currently living in tents and temporary shelters.
It is also interesting to see who is being asked to foot the bill. The United States is offering a large anchor investment, but they are looking to the Gulf states like Turkey and Egypt to provide the rest.
Yeah, and those regional partners are hesitant. Their priority right now is not luxury resorts. It is a stable Palestinian led government and a durable ceasefire. While the United States is pushing this Project Sunrise vision, the ceasefire itself is incredibly fragile. We have seen hundreds of violations reported since October, and the trust required to begin a 20-year construction project is just not there.
So we have two competing visions of the future. One is a gritty, violent struggle between Hamas and the local militias for control of the ruins, and the other is a billion-dollar vision of a Mediterranean tech hub.
Both are currently stalled by the same issue: security. Till there's a clear answer on who holds the monopoly on force in Gaza, neither the militias nor the luxury developers can truly move forward. Now, the militias are currently serving what some experts call a pretend population in the eastern zones because most civilians are too afraid to move into those Israeli controlled areas.
I mean, this certainly complicates the diplomatic efforts currently happening in Miami and Cairo. We'll have to see if the Project Sunrise plan, with its vision of a futuristic high tech Gaza, actually gains any traction with regional donors, or if it remains a 32-page PowerPoint vision while the reality on the ground tells a much different story. But before we pivot across the Atlantic to another unfolding crisis, let's be real for a second. The news cycle right now is absolutely relentless. And if you're like us, you aren't looking for more headlines, you are looking for clarity. You're trying to spot the signal in all that noise without burning out. This is why ground news is such a vital partner for us. We aren't just reading a script here. This is a tool we rely on daily to navigate the chaos. We genuinely respect their mission to break people out of their echo chambers. We specifically recommend the Vantage subscription so you can see the full spectrum of media bias, literally seeing how the same story is being framed by different sides in real time. And right now, you can get 40% off by using our link. If you want to support the show and, frankly, just get smarter about how you consume information, go check it out. It's a great way to take advantage of the deal. The link is waiting for you in the show notes, or you can find it right in our Instagram bio. Now, moving from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean, because the geopolitical pressure isn't just mounting in the Middle East, we really need to sit with what is happening in the Caribbean right now. It feels as though we woke up this morning to a map that looks significantly different than it did just a few months ago. All right, the U.S. has just seized the Centuries, a second oil tanker in as many weeks. It seems that the blockade President Trump mentioned is no longer just rhetoric.
Yeah, it is a functional reality now. The seizure of the Centuries by the Coast Guard and the Department of War is a major tactical escalation. This was a pre-dawn operation in international waters, and it used specialized teams and heavy naval support.
What's interesting to me is the justification. The administration is leaning very heavily into the narco-terrorism label. They are tying the oil directly to the funding of criminal networks, but there seems to be a gap between the official narrative and the maritime records. The Centuries, for instance, was not even on the Treasury's sanctioned vessel list, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And this is where the intelligence picture kind of gets complicated. So, by bypassing the traditional sanctions list and moving straight to interdiction, the U.S. is essentially saying that the link to the Maduro administration is enough to justify a seizure. That's regardless of the flag the ship is flying. So this creates a high risk environment for the quote, dark fleet, end quote, those tankers that operate on the fringes to move Venezuelan crude oil.
Well, I want to touch on the historical weight of this. People are drawing a lot of lines back to 1989 and the invasion of Panama. We are seeing 15,000 troops and the USS Gerald Ford in the region. Are we looking at a blueprint for regime change, or is this something different?
I mean, there are parallels. Certainly, we all see them. Both situations involved a Latin American leader accused by Washington of drug trafficking. We had Noriega back then. We have Maduro now. But the operational landscape is a bit different. Noriega was a former asset with a very documented paper trail. With Maduro, the U.S. points to the Cartel of the Suns. Analysts are still debating if that is a structured organization or just a term for systemic corruption among the Venezuelan elite.
And that leads to the human cost. We have reports of over 20 strikes on boats in the Caribbean and Pacific, with nearly 100 deaths. The administration calls them narco terrorists engaged in irregular warfare. However, legal experts are raising flags about the legality of these strikes, specifically a September incident where survivors of an initial strike were reportedly targeted again.
Yeah, that is the what we call non-international armed conflict designation. So, by framing this as a war against cartels rather than a standard law enforcement action, the Pentagon uses different rules of engagement. It allows for lethal force in international waters. Now, the tension here is that while the U.S. claims these boats carry fentanyl and cocaine, the public evidence has been thin. Intelligence suggests Venezuela is more of a transit point than the primary producer, especially for fentanyl, which mostly moves through Mexico. Now, we can't overlook the fact that U.S. Southcom is doing deliberate targeting and identifying intelligence that they say shows these boats are being used to transport these drugs. They're saying fentanyl. This is mostly cocaine that's being moved around, but the U.S. is declaring both as weapons of mass destruction. So the legal experts, to me, seem more like political talking heads. I could tell you from personal experience, lawyers and government leads are in the rooms approving these strikes. It's not just some random Navy SEAL who wants to relive their glory days in Iraq and Afghanistan.
If the legal framework is being built in the room while the operations are happening, it suggests the U.S. is creating a new doctrine entirely. But if we follow that logic, treating a narcotics shipment as a WMD, where does that lead us? If a Panamanian or Liberian flagship is suspected of carrying what the U.S. now defines as a, quote, weapon, end quote, does the right of innocent passage effectively disappear in this hemisphere?
I mean, it certainly does appear that way. So everything you said is correct. By elevating narcotics to WMD status, the administration is attempting to bypass the law of the sea. Usually, you would need the consent of the flagged state of that ship to board the vessel in international waters. But if you are what the administration says is defending the nation against a weapon of mass destruction, the necessity and proportionality argument kind of changes. The U.S. is essentially asserting a right to preemptive self-defense. They're saying they will not wait for that weapon to reach a street corner in Miami or the streets of Chicago.
And yet we see the Venezuelan Navy now moving to escort these tankers. If Maduro's forces are providing a physical shield for vessels the U.S. has designated as narco-terrorist transports, we're no longer talking about interdicting smugglers. We are talking about a direct military-to-military confrontation.
Yeah, and that is the ultimate red line in the intelligence community. So you have an escort, and that is a statement of sovereignty. If a U.S. commander has orders to neutralize a WMD threat and a Venezuelan frigate is standing in the way, the rules of engagement for non-international armed conflict start to look a lot like the rules for a standard interstate war.
Well, it feels as though the blockade is designed to provoke exactly that kind of choice. Like, it forces Maduro to either lose his revenue or risk his navy.
Yeah, and it places the U.S. personnel in a position where their legal top cover is going to be tested in real time. This is why the presence of the USS Gerald Ford is so significant. It is not there to catch speedboats. It is there to provide the heavy infrastructure for a much larger conflict if that spark finally occurs.
While the maritime borders are hardening, we have to look at how this is echoing inland. The pressure in the Caribbean is beginning to affect the stability of the neighboring states as well. I know we are talking about the drug war, but from what I am noticing, it sounds like the oil is the real gravity center here because the strikes are on small drug boats, but these seizures are of oil tankers. To me, it seems like the U.S. is saying if we cut off the oil, we can cut off the lifeblood of the Maduro government.
Yeah, again, you're absolutely right. Oil revenue funds more than half of the Venezuelan budget. If the U.S. can successfully scare off the dark fleet, and we're already seeing ships flee to the Indian Ocean to hide, the Maduro administration faces a total financial drought. President Trump has been very candid about this. He's even suggested the U.S. might simply, his words, quote, keep the oil, end quote, from the seized tankers.
And Maduro has responded by ordering his Navy to escort these tankers. That feels like a powder keg. If a U.S. destroyer and a Venezuelan naval vessel meet while a tanker is being boarded, the margin for error is almost zero.
And that would certainly be the spark needed for a war. In 1989, this was the death of a U.S. Marine at a checkpoint. In 2025, it could be a misunderstanding during a boarding operation. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and other advisors have made it clear that the status quo is intolerable and that they are prepared to use every element of national power. They are no longer just trying to stop drugs. They are trying to force a collapse.
It is a high-stakes gamble that assumes the regime will cry uncle before the situation turns into an open, kinetic war on the mainland. We have seen the airspace closed and an ultimatum for Maduro to leave already come and go. It's a lot to process, especially considering how quickly the military footprint has grown. We will definitely be watching the UN Security Council closely to see if Venezuela's complaints gain any traction. But for now, the Caribbean remains a very active theater of operation. So let's pivot back to the Middle East. While the eyes of the world are on the Caribbean, we are seeing a significant escalation in Syria following the deaths of 2 American soldiers and a civilian interpreter in Palmyra. The White House and the Department of Defense are calling it, quote, Operation Hawkeye Strike, end quote. All right, so Kervin, before we dive into the mechanics of the response, can we talk about the catalyst? There seems to be some friction between the official narrative and what is being reported on the ground regarding who actually pulled the trigger.
Yeah, look, and last week we touched on this very briefly at the end of the episode. This is why I wanted to wait to kind of cover this later. What we know is that multiple service members were killed and wounded. And those are U.S. service members in an attack that U.S. Central Command maintains was conducted by an ISIS operative. Now, local reports and the Syrian Ministry of Interior suggest the gunman was actually a member of the Syrian Internal Security Forces. Now, if that is true, we are looking at what we call a green on blue incident. It's an insider attack within a facility where U.S. and Syrian forces were supposed to be cooperating.
That changes the math for the intelligence community, does it not? If it is an insider, is it still an ISIS attack?
I mean, it can be both. Look, I've been in meetings with partner forces to provide information on insurgents in the region, and those very insurgents were actually in the room. We were looking at them as we were providing this information. Radicalization does not always require a formal uniform. Now, the working theory among many analysts is that even if the individual was part of the state security apparatus, they likely held ISIS sympathies or they were actually a sleeper within the new government's ranks. Now, the U.S. military is treating it as an ISIS-directed or ISIS-inspired event because that allows them to apply their existing counterterrorism mandates to strike back.
And strike back they did. The scale seems massive. Over 70 targets and 100 precision munitions. We heard Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth use some very pointed language, calling it a declaration of vengeance. That feels more emotional than the usual clinical language we get from the Pentagon.
Yeah, man, we've seen this since January, right? This shift in communication style. So for Secretary Hegseth to frame it as vengeance, the administration is attempting to establish a very clear deterrent. The message here is if you target Americans, the response will be disproportionate and it's going to be personal. But if you look past the rhetoric at the targets themselves, what was actually struck were weapons caches, infrastructure, drone cells. This was a calculated effort to degrade the operational capacity of ISIS remnants. They're not just hitting back because the U.S. is angry. The U.S. is hitting back to ensure the next ambush is harder to execute.
You mentioned the new Syrian government. We have President Ahmed al Shara in power now, and he has been vocal about his support for these U.S. strikes. For those who remember the last decade of the Assad regime, this partnership feels like a complete 180-degree turn.
And it's a new era, but it is a new era born out of necessity. The Shura government is trying to consolidate power and bring stability back to a country that has been a battlefield for many years. They view ISIS as much of a threat to their new authority as the U.S. does to U.S. personnel. So, by allowing U.S. jets and, I'll say, Jordanian aircraft into the airspace to conduct these strikes, they are essentially outsourcing the high end kinetic work of national security.
Does this level of cooperation actually make our troops safer, or does it just make the insider threat you mentioned earlier more likely because the lines between the two militaries are blurring?
Now, look, that's the tension that we are going to be watching. Integration brings intelligence and access, but it also brings vulnerability. So when you share a base or a command center with a foreign partner, you are betting on their vetting process. So after the fall of the previous regime, the security services in Syria are in a state of flux. So it's very easy for an extremist to slip through the cracks during a period of restructuring.
We also saw Jordan jump into this operation, like you mentioned earlier. Some of their aircraft did some of the strikes. That
Yep.
stood out to me. So, why was their involvement so critical this time around?
Look, Jordan has a direct stake in Syrian stability. They have seen ISIS attempting to reconstitute in southern Syria, that is near their border. So, for the Royal Jordanian Air Force to participate, it signals a regional consensus. So, this is not just Washington, D.C. acting alone. This is a coalition of neighbors who realize that if the new Syrian government cannot hold the line against these 5 to 7,000 remaining ISIS fighters, the chaos is going to spill over their borders next.
It's a sobering reminder that even though the caliphate fell years ago, the ideology and the cells are still very much alive within the desert. We are seeing a lot of precision in these strikes, particularly the use of GBU 31 systems. So, for the non experts, including me, why are they choosing that specific path?
Yeah, I think so. This is a typical munition that we will use on targeted strikes. And the reason for that is because your goal is maximum impact with minimal collateral damage. So if the U.S. wants the Syrian public to support this new alliance, they cannot afford to be reckless. Using precision munitions against verified infrastructure allows them to dismantle the group's logistics while trying to maintain the moral high ground in a very volatile environment.
It is a delicate balance to strike, especially when the rhetoric from the top is so aggressive. We have to wonder how the local population reconciles vengeance with precision. While we will certainly be watching how the Shara administration handles the fallout of this internally, it is a lot to digest for 1 week. And as we see these theater dynamics shift, we have to look at how this impacts the broader footprint across the Middle East. Before we sign off, is there anything else that you would like to discuss?
Sorry, this is a day late. Yeah, sometimes internet in Germany sucks. And that happened yesterday.
Yeah, he sounded like he was in a tunnel or underwater or something. I could barely understand what was
Yeah,
being said.
it was interesting because I went back to listen to it and I could hear myself at the beginning, when we were doing sort of the pre
Mm.
before.
Yeah.
And then the moment you were talking about me sounding like I was underwater, nothing was coming through.
Nothing from your side was coming
Nope,
through?
nothing. It's just a huge gap of nothingness, which some people enjoy, right?
Yeah. When you're quiet. When
When
you're
I'm
quiet. Yeah.
quiet.
Well, I mean, you didn't sound like you were underwater today, so fear not. It should have recorded.
Yeah, I'm certain it did. It was the internet.
Well,
Germany's been
anyways,
having a lot of issues.
yeah, thank you for being patient. Better a little late than not at all. And also, happy holidays to our listeners.
Happy Hanukkah, happy Merry Christmas to those who celebrate. Yeah. Happy New Year. Actually, we'll do another episode before the new year. So
Yeah, we have another episode. Thank you so much for listening to This Week Explained. We hope that you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we would love to hear from you. For more in-depth coverage of these stories and more, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.